begins this lesson for Higher Biology. We are in Unit 3, Sustainability and Interdependence, and this is Key Area 5, Symbiosis. Before this, we were having a wee look at animal welfare, and we're now going to move on to look at symbiosis, which is really essentially a close relationship between different species. Before we move on to look at social behaviour, which will focus more around the relationships of organisms of the same species. So what we're looking for you to do is understand the close relationships of different species. You need to be able to define the terms symbiosis, parasitism and mutualism. You need to be able to explain that a parasite will gain energy or nutrients and the loss of these will harm our host. You need to be able to give examples of parasite transmission which uses direct contact, vectors, resistant stages or secondary hosts. And you need to be able to give examples of mutualistic relationships. Now, first of all, what do we mean by symbiosis? So, symbiosis is an ecological relationship between organisms of two different species, and these species live in direct contact with one another. These are usually very intimate relationships. They have often evolved over millions of years, or in fact have co-evolved. So as one organism has evolved, so has the other, usually to keep that relationship going. And there are two main types of symbiosis: parasitism and mutualism. Now, a parasite is an organism which usually requires its host for survival. So in this case, in parasitism, our organism, the parasite, is going to usually derive its nutrition from the other organism, the host. That's the organism which it exploits. The host is usually harmed or at least loses some energy and or materials to the parasite. Now, these may be noticeable or not noticeable. So, for example, if you've ever had a midgie bite, that was a parasite coming to feast on you. A little bit uncomfortable perhaps, maybe a little bit itchy, not all that nice, but relatively harmless for you. Other parasites though, not so harmless. Tapeworms, for example, may be able to live inside their hosts. These types of organisms that are able to do that usually have quite a limited metabolism and they can't survive outside the body. The advantage of living inside your host, however, is that you don't need a digestive system. Your host has already digested the food that is available to you, so you don't expend as much energy on using that. These types of parasite tend to be more limited physically, they're often blind, they're not going to be able to survive if they are left outside of their organism. Other parasites, so our ticks, head lice, fleas, for example, are able to live outside of their hosts and they can move from organism to organism, from host to host. Now, our parasites can be transmitted in three main ways. There is the first one, direct contact. So on the left here, we have a lovely head louse, and that, as we all know, is passed through direct contact from human to human. We also have body lice or scabies, which again is passed from human to human and will cause an allergic reaction of the type seen on the skin there. Now, some parasites are able to create what we call resistant stages, and that allows them to be transmitted from a different host, from one host to another, over quite a significant period of time. So on the left hand side we have a flea, this is a cat flea larva, and it's able to survive dormant for quite some time, for example when it's lying in carpets, for example, until it comes across another host. Tapeworms, pinworms, threadworms are often able to produce eggs which will be excreted by the host in their waste, and if hygiene is not top of the list for that particular species, those eggs can be passed on from that host to another, When the secondary host ingests the eggs, these will then make their way to the intestine and hatch into second worms. And again, depending on the type of organism, depending on the type of parasite, these resistant stages, these eggs or these larvae can survive for a number of weeks. So it can be quite a significant infection that can be passed on from one host to another, even when those hosts don't see each other at all. Finally, we have a vector which may be used to transmit a parasite from one host to another. So the most common example we have of this is a mosquito acting as a vector. And a vector is really when we're using a different species to pass on our parasite. In this case, the parasite is a Plasmodium bacteria, which causes malaria. And that bacteria is living inside of the blood of one host. When the mosquito comes along and bites that host, it carries the infected blood along with it. So it's carrying that parasite, the bacteria, within it. And when it goes along to bite a second host, it transfers some of that bacteria into the bloodstream of the new host. And consequently, we're passing it from one host to another. And it's maybe possible that those two individual host organisms don't actually ever see each other. So that's one example of how we may use a vector as transmission. And it is the case that in this particular example, a mosquito is not going to be affected by the Plasmodium bacteria. Now, parasites have two main types of life cycle. They can have a direct life cycle or they can have an indirect life cycle. And in the direct life cycle, this is where our eggs are shed, they're left elsewhere, and they will be passed on to a new member of the host species. So in this case, again, we've got our fleas. So possible for the cat to have fleas. The adult fleas are going to lay eggs on the ground. These are going to hatch into larvae, and then they're going to live around and will attach themselves to a new host as they develop. On the other hand, we have a secondary life cycle or an indirect life cycle, and that's where, in addition to using a primary host species as a site for sexual reproduction, the parasite becomes adapted by evolution to employ a secondary host species in its life cycle. So, for example, here we have an adult tapeworm, and that is living in the small intestine of a human. Those humans are producing waste, and within that waste are the eggs of these adult tapeworms. So these tapeworms are surviving, they are living within that small intestine, and they're reproducing and producing eggs. When they produce those eggs, that's going to go into the feces of our human, and our human is going to be producing those feces which may contaminate vegetation. In this case, the contaminated vegetation is ingested by pigs, and what happens is the eggs are then going to hatch into larvae, and they are going to infect the muscle tissue of our pig. So the larvae were going to exist as cysts in the muscle tissue, undetectable, we wouldn't see them. What we then have to be careful about is the fact that if we do not cook that food appropriately, or it's handled raw, so if someone's picking up that raw food and then not washing their hands properly, that human is then going to ingest the contaminated food. So it's going to ingest the eggs, and it will be passed on through the intestine, where those eggs are going to hatch out. The head of the tapeworm attaches to the intestine, and the tapeworm will grow and survive within the small intestine of its new host. So there we've used a secondary organism, in this case the pig, as our vector almost to transfer it from one host to another. Now, finally, we have a type of symbiotic relationship which is called mutualism. And in a mutual symbiotic relationship, both organisms involved are actually able to benefit from the relationship. So we have a relationship where both organisms provide a service, for example, clownfish and anemones. We also have relationships where one organism provides service and another receives a resource. So, for example, flowering plants and bees, where the bee is receiving the nectar from the flowering plant and the flowering plant is receiving pollination from the bee. The bee is carrying out that pollination on its behalf. You might also have a relationship where both organisms are going to receive a resource. So, for example, the human gut has got bacteria living in it, which are gaining a food source from what is being ingested by the human, and in return, those bacteria are breaking down that food on behalf of the human, helping that be digested faster. And as we are discovering every day, some of these bacteria are also able to affect the quality and quantity of hormones produced, having quite a significant effect on the rest of the body as well. So from that, you should be able to explain what we mean by symbiosis, parasitism and mutualism. Explain that a parasite will gain energy or nutrients and the loss of these will harm the host in some way. That parasites can be transmitted using direct contact, vectors and resistant stages, and we may also involve a secondary host. And you should be able to give some examples of mutualistic relationships.